Imagine living for 85 years with a gaping hole in your history, a name whispered but never confirmed, a story deliberately buried. For decades, Evelyn's world was a quiet, respectable shade of grey, defined by what she didn't know. Her mother, a woman of brittle silence and immovable routine, had taken the full, true tale of Evelyn's father to her grave, bricking up the past like a forbidden tomb. But at 85, when the world expected her to be sorting memories, not hunting for them, a single water-stained photograph arrived in the mail. It was a man's face, smiling, eyes that seemed to know a terrible long-held truth, and scrawled on the back, two words that shattered Evelyn's carefully constructed reality: your inheritance. This is the untold saga of Evelyn Roth, and how the discovery of a father she never knew, a man silenced by the Great War and a promise broken by fear, revealed three life-changing secrets about resilience, forgiveness, and the true meaning of legacy. If you believe your past is set in stone, what you are about to hear, the wisdom of 8 decades of waiting, will rewrite everything. Evelyn was born in 1938 in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Boston, a world away from the dust and desperation of the war that was soon to engulf Europe. Her life was orderly, almost religiously so. She was a librarian, a curator of other people's stories, yet her own began with a crucial omission. The air in their small, perfect home always felt heavy, thick with unspoken secrets, like a thunderstorm perpetually waiting to break. Her mother, Agnes, was a beautiful, stern woman who excelled at controlling narratives. When the neighborhood ladies would ask about Evelyn's father, Agnes's response was always the same, delivered with cold finality. He was a casualty of the times, a brief, unfortunate misunderstanding. We do not speak of him. Evelyn learned early on that certain questions were not just rude, they were a violation. They brought a particular shadow to Agnes's eyes, a look of trapped panic. So, Evelyn adapted. She built a life based on stability and predictability, a fortress against the chaos implied by her unknown origins. She married a good, practical man, raised 2 sensible children, and retired to a small cottage, surrounded by books and the illusion of completeness. But secrets, like seeds, do not die. They simply wait for the right conditions to sprout. The day the envelope arrived, the scent of dust and old paper hung heavy in the air. The postmark was from a remote, sun-bleached town in rural England. When Evelyn opened the envelope and the photograph fell onto her antique mahogany table, the world tilted. The man wasn't just a stranger. He looked unsettlingly familiar, like an answer to a lifelong question she'd been too afraid to ask out loud. Below the chilling inscription, "Your inheritance," was a lawyer's card and a single address. It referred to a safe deposit box, untouched for 70 years. The photograph itself, warm and yellowed, seemed to hum with forgotten energy. Evelyn's hand, wrinkled from 8 decades of living, trembled as she picked it up. She had always believed her father was simply gone, but this photo whispered a far more complex truth. He had been waiting. The sheer audacity of the secret, that her father had left her a specific, tangible thing, a message in a bottle cast 7 decades prior, was overwhelming. It wasn't about money. It was about context. It was about knowing where her own story truly began. This was her first true test of resilience in her later life, deciding whether to maintain the comfortable silence her mother had enforced or to shatter the glass and step into the dangerous, unknown truth. The fear was immense, but the craving for her own legacy was stronger. Evelyn packed a small bag. She was 85 years old and she was finally going home. The journey across the Atlantic was agonizing, not because of the distance, but because of the vast emotional chasm Evelyn was crossing. She felt like two people, The dutiful, retired librarian and the nervous 8-year-old girl finally looking for answers. The conflict wasn't just external, the lost father, it was internal. It was the lifelong feeling of being unrooted, of having a foundation built on sand. When she arrived at the lawyer's dusty office in London, the air was cold and smelled of old leather and forgotten deeds. The lawyer, a man younger than her own children, spoke in hushed, reverent tones. He explained that Evelyn's father, a young soldier named Thomas Ainsworth, had instructed his family to wait until the time was right. His sister, Evelyn's aunt, who had kept the flame alive, had recently passed away at 97, finally releasing the box under the strict instructions Thomas had set in 1945. This was the first hint of the profound injustice that shaped Evelyn's life. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had been silenced. The safe deposit box, when finally retrieved, was not large, but it felt impossibly heavy. Evelyn placed her key into the lock. The metallic click was the loudest sound she had heard in 85 years. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, only 3 items: a worn leather journal, a small silver locket, and a thick bundle of letters tied with a military ribbon. She opened the journal first. The handwriting was sharp, determined, and deeply poetic. Thomas Ainsworth had been an artist and a philosopher drafted into the war. The pages weren't a diary of battle, but a desperate, coded love letter to Agnes, Evelyn's mother, written between 1942 and 1944. The first great revelation arrived on the first page, shaking Evelyn to her core. Thomas hadn't been a casualty of the times. He had been severely wounded in North Africa and spent 2 years recovering. He wrote about his deep, unwavering love for Agnes and his excitement about Evelyn, his little sparrow. He wrote, "My dearest Agnes, I know the scar on my face frightens you. I know the limp slows me down. But I am coming home for you and our daughter. Tell Evelyn I am fighting for the courage to be her hero. Don't hide the truth. Promise me, darling, promise me you will wait." Evelyn dropped the journal. Her mother hadn't been heartbroken. She had been ashamed. Agnes, a woman obsessed with reputation and surface perfection, had rejected Thomas, not because he was poor, but because he was a damaged veteran. Her father had returned, and her mother had shut the door, choosing social standing over love. The scent of the old leather journal now felt less like history and more like betrayal. Evelyn realized the coldness she had always felt in her childhood home wasn't just Agnes's nature. It was her mother's penance for a terrible decision. Agnes hadn't just lost a husband. She had actively erased a loving father from her daughter's life, forcing Evelyn to pay the price for her own vanity. Evelyn, the woman who had always prided herself on logic and control, felt a scorching, unfamiliar wave of anger, followed by an equally immense wave of sorrow for the young man who had fought a war only to be defeated by the woman he loved. She looked at the locket. It was tarnished silver, and inside there were 2 miniatures, one of Agnes, youthful and beautiful, and one of a tiny, swaddled baby, Evelyn herself. Thomas had carried that locket through the brutal North African campaign. He never saw his daughter again after he received Agnes's final, definitive letter, but it was the bundle of letters that held the key to her past and the promise of the secrets that would change her future. She picked up the thick ribbon. These were the only words she would ever receive from her father, a man dead for over 6 decades, but speaking to her now across the chasm of time and silence. Evelyn spent the next 2 days in her London hotel room, wrapped in a blanket, drowning in the pages of the past. The letters from Thomas were not just documents, they were sensory experiences. She could almost smell the smoke and the dry dust of the Libyan desert, hear the distant muffled thunder of the guns. Thomas, the young artistic soul, had been a reluctant soldier. But his letters detailed the harsh, unforgiving crucible of the war, not through battle plans, but through the profound wisdom he extracted from the suffering. The lesson of the unbreakable will. He described marching for days without water, the sun beating down until the sand seemed to shimmer and mock them. In a passage marked with a small, faded tear stain, he wrote, "I saw men break when they focused on the thirst, but the men who endured, they focused only on the next step. Not the end of the journey, not the promise of the oasis, but the simple, unheroic act of moving one boot after the other. It is the greatest lesson the desert taught me, Agnes. Resilience isn't a grand gesture. It's the quiet, stubborn refusal to lie down." Evelyn, at 85, recognized this truth immediately. Her life of quiet routine, her decades of enduring the silence, had been her own kind of stubborn march. She realized her resilience was not despite her father's absence, but perhaps a mirrored echo of the resilience he had to learn just to survive. The sound of silence and the price of noise. Thomas's observations were cinematic. He wrote about the silence of the North African nights, a profound darkness punctuated only by the distant calls of sentries. He explained how, in that overwhelming quiet, the real sounds of life became clear, the faint sound of his own heart beating, the memory of Agnes's laugh, the tiny cry of Evelyn as a baby. Here, the men crave the noise of the fighting because it distracts them from the greater, more terrifying sound, the voice inside their own heads. I have learned to listen to that voice. It speaks the truth, often the harsh truth, but always the truth needed for tomorrow. Tell Evelyn, if she's ever lost, she must seek the silence first. That is where her inner compass resides. This hit Evelyn hard. Her mother, Agnes, had spent her entire life filling the house with noise, of social chatter, of rules, of superficial concerns, to drown out the silence where the truth of Thomas lay waiting. Evelyn understood now that her father was teaching her the true value of introspection, a lesson often dismissed in the busy modern world. Evelyn paused, running her fingers over the brittle paper. The faint smell of tobacco and some kind of foreign spice emanated from the ribbon, transporting her. The light from the London window was cold and grey, a stark contrast to the relentless heat described in the pages, yet the emotional warmth of Thomas's spirit bridged the decades. She was sitting in 2023, but she was living in 1944. This was not just a story about a man. It was a guide left by a spirit determined to reach his daughter. He knew he might not survive the war, but he made sure his wisdom did. Thomas's letters outlined the core conflict of his life, the fight for his soul against the chaos of war, and his subsequent fight for his family against Agnes's fear. He confessed his own deepest failure, not the one on the battlefield, but the failure to convince Agnes that true strength lies in vulnerability, not in the polished facade. This profound, quiet struggle was the real core of the story, and it led directly to the critical moment that would change everything. The bundle contained one last sealed envelope, separate from the others. The paper was thicker, stiffer, and bore the deep impression of a military seal, though the actual seal was long gone. Evelyn was hesitant to open it. It felt like the definitive conclusion, the final word from a man who had already given her so much. She held the envelope up to the light. The scent now was distinctly of brine, and something acrid, almost metallic. Inside, she found a single short letter, dated October 1945, and a faded copy of a discharge document. The letter explained that Thomas, having survived the war and his recovery, had returned to America and located Agnes. He detailed the scene, the perfectly manicured lawn, the polished silver, the look of panic and disdain in Agnes's eyes when she saw his scar and his limp. She told him he was a a reminder of a life she was determined to forget, and that Evelyn was better off without the burden of a damaged father. The second great revelation arrived here, a blow of staggering intensity. Thomas didn't simply leave. He fought for Evelyn. He spent 6 agonizing months trying to convince Agnes, sending letters, waiting outside the house just to catch a glimpse of his daughter. The discharge document revealed the catalyst for his final agonizing decision. Thomas was not only physically scarred, he was facing a severe, undiagnosed case of what they then called shell shock. The document stated he was deemed unfit for stable civilian life. Thomas knew with devastating clarity that Agnes would use his mental fragility and his physical scars against him in any custody battle. She would paint him as a threat, a ruined man who could only bring shame and instability. This realization was the true point of no return. Thomas, the man who had learned resilience in the desert, now faced his greatest inner conflict. Could he subject his daughter to a lifetime of legal battles and the public shame of having a father who was seen as broken? He wrote his final note to Evelyn, the note contained within the envelope, knowing he would not be the one to deliver it. "My little sparrow, I cannot give you my name, because that would mean a fight that would destroy the peace your mother demands. I can't let my scars become your burden. So I make the ultimate sacrifice of a man who has nothing left to give. I will disappear so you can have a life of certainty. I will entrust my story, my whole truth, and the wisdom I found in the dirt to the only person I trust, my sister, your Aunt Maeve. I will create a path for you to find me, but only when you are an adult, strong enough to handle the complexity." He sealed his truth inside the box, a time capsule of love and sacrifice. Thomas then walked away, vanishing into the post-war anonymity, choosing his daughter's perceived peace over his own happiness. He dedicated his remaining life to ensuring the box, and the truth it contained, would eventually find its way to her. Evelyn's breath hitched. She could almost hear the click of the front door closing as Thomas walked away from his only child. The silence of the hotel room was now filled with the profound sound of his heartbroken footsteps. She wasn't just reading a document, she was witnessing a man sacrifice his identity for love. The overwhelming feeling wasn't pity, but a fierce protective pride. Her father hadn't been a brief, unfortunate misunderstanding. He had been a hero who chose anonymity. This incredible sacrifice led to the existence of the inheritance itself. The box wasn't a secret. It was a promise kept over 8 decades. The weight of her mother's deliberate deception lifted, replaced by the colossal weight of her father's love. Evelyn was no longer angry with Agnes. She pitied the woman who had lived a joyless life to maintain a facade. Now, at 85, Evelyn was ready to receive the 3 life-changing secrets Thomas had bequeathed her, the wisdom he forged in the heat of battle and the cold of heartbreak. These secrets, contained in the final letters, were his enduring legacy, a message not just for his daughter, but for anyone seeking true resilience and peace in a chaotic world. Thomas wrote of seeing everything he owned destroyed, his home, his dreams, his health, and yet surviving. "My little sparrow, when you have nothing left to lose, you discover what truly cannot be taken from you. Never attach your identity to what is external, not money, not titles, not even the approval of society. Your mother valued the house. I valued the ability to rebuild. If your identity fits in a backpack, you are unbreakable. The man who fears loss is already lost. The core of who you are, your integrity, your capacity for love, your commitment to the next step, that is your true, portable wealth." Application for the viewer. Evelyn realized this was the counterlesson to her mother's materialism. For the viewer today, this secret means that fear of job loss or social standing should never dictate your decisions. Your true power resides in your moral compass and your spirit. not your bank account. This secret came directly from Thomas's understanding of his own resentment towards Agnes and the path he chose instead of bitterness. I could have hated Agnes. I could have allowed her betrayal to rot my soul. But hatred is a prison you build for two, and only you hold the keys. Forgiveness is not about declaring the other person innocent. It is about declaring yourself free. It is the map you use to escape the past. It is the hardest thing a resilient heart must do. Release the debt others owe you. It is the most powerful act of self-care. I chose to forgive Agnes, not for her, but so I could die a free man, knowing my love remained pure. Evelyn, holding the letters, finally found the strength to forgive her own mother. Agnes's silence had been a burden, but Thomas's wisdom was the release. The lesson is universal. Holding on to old grievances binds you to the very trauma you are trying to overcome. This was Thomas's final, poignant piece of advice, written in the knowledge that he would never hold Evelyn again. I am leaving you this letter, my sparrow, because I was silenced. Do not allow your life to be dictated by the things you were too polite, too afraid, or too busy to say. The cost of an unsaid "I love you" or an unsaid "I need help" grows exponentially with time. Life is too short to be subtle about joy and too important to be silent about pain. Use your voice. Tell your truths, even if they shake the world. I chose silence for your peace. Now I urge you to choose your voice for your freedom. Evelyn stood up. The air in the room felt lighter. The burden of 8 decades of unspoken history finally lifted. Her father's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. It had preserved the wisdom she needed most. At 85, Evelyn had found her father, and in doing so, had finally found herself. This was the ultimate triumph, realizing that her lineage was not defined by her mother's shame, but by her father's unbreakable spiritual legacy. Evelyn closed the journal, the locket, and the bundle of letters. The sheer force of Thomas Ainsworth's love, preserved through the decades, was a stunning force of resilience. She realized that her father, the man her mother tried to erase, was the most stable, most enduring force in her entire life. He hadn't just given her an inheritance, he had given her a roadmap to an emotionally wealthy existence. There was one last tiny item tucked beneath the letters, a silver key, smaller than the others, attached to a simple tag reading, "For the other box." Evelyn felt a shiver travel down her spine. The lawyer confirmed that Thomas had established a second deposit box, this one intended only if the first was successfully claimed by Evelyn. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a final, thrilling validation. Thomas had anticipated that his daughter, even after 8 decades of living under her mother's shadow, would possess the courage to seek the truth. The second box was in a different bank entirely, containing Thomas's greatest passion, his artwork. It held dozens of sketches and charcoal drawings, capturing the raw, beautiful soul of the man, but tucked into the back of one frame was a final, surprising document. It was a transfer of ownership for a small, dilapidated farmhouse nestled deep in the English countryside, dated 1948. Thomas, unable to live with Agnes, had found a solitary place to rebuild his life, continuing to paint until his death in the early 1960s. He had never stopped loving, and he had never stopped creating. Evelyn, the woman who had lived a life of routine and control, now owned a house of forgotten art and untold stories. It was a tangible connection, a place where her father's spirit remained vibrant. She was 85, and her life was not winding down. It was beginning again. The greatest secret Thomas left her wasn't about money or material possessions. It was the powerful, life-altering truth that it is never too late to inherit your own life. It is never too late to forgive the past, reclaim your story, or find the courage to begin living the life your parents, the ones who truly loved you, wanted for you. Evelyn, holding the sketch of the old farmhouse, saw her own resilience reflected in her father's enduring spirit. Her triumph was not the discovery of wealth, but the liberation from a lie that had stolen 8 decades of her life. She stood now, ready to embrace the legacy of courage and forgiveness. This story is a powerful testament to the fact that the most valuable inheritance we receive is not physical, but spiritual. The wisdom forged in hardship. Evelyn Roth learned at 85 that her father's absence was his greatest act of love, and that his silent wisdom would guide her forward. What past are you ready to unlock? What story are you allowing fear to keep hidden? If Evelyn's extraordinary journey through 8 decades of silence inspired you to seek your own truth, then join the community that values wisdom and resilience. Subscribe to the Triumph Stories now. Help us share these life-changing legacies, ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of our elders never fades. What lesson from this story resonated most deeply with you? Let us know in the comments below.